He felt the stranger's arms tangle around his waist before he could even register what was happening. It was early morning on the city sidewalk, just after the sun transformed the pavement into a patchwork of light and shadow. The millionaire, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that cost more than most people earned in a year, froze. His coffee trembled in his hand. The man clinging to him was filthy, clothes in tatters, hair matted and unwashed, and his eyes were brimming with tears. "You're my son," the beggar whispered, voice cracking with emotion. The stranger recoiled, alarm flaring in his bloodshot eyes. He stared at the man's face as if searching for a clue to explain the confession. His mind raced through every possible scenario. A prank? A gambler's tactic? A madman's delusion? His heartbeat thundered against his ribcage, and the crowd passing by slowed, curious. The beggar's grip tightened. "I can prove it," he insisted, voice raw. When the millionaire gently tried to pull away, the man sobbed, collapsed at his feet, and pounded the pavement with guilt and desperation. Financial mogul to the core, the millionaire felt an unbearable weight of responsibility pressed down on him, far heavier than any audit or boardroom dispute he'd ever faced. He signaled a passerby to call for help. A uniformed officer arrived, cautious but empathetic, and separated them. The beggar was led away to a nearby precinct for questioning. The millionaire stood alone, clutching his cup, stunned. His mind replayed the claim over and over, "You're my son." That phrase would echo in his ears for days. He was in the middle of a busy downtown intersection, yet in that moment it felt as though the world had fallen silent. Later that afternoon, after a whirlwind of phone calls and an emergency meeting with his personal assistant, he sat in the back of a black sedan that purred through the city streets like a contented tiger. His assistant, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, slid a manila folder across the leather seat. "These are the files we dug up on him," she said. Inside were copies of the beggar's ID, though it was months expired, medical, records from a charity clinic, and a sparse social services file. But there was no information tying him to the millionaire's family. "No one remembered him," she summarized. The millionaire stared at the dated documents. There were gaps of years where the man had vanished entirely. No school records, no birth certificate that aligned with his own, no trace in the family's private archives. He closed the folder and sank into the seat. Something about the man's eyes had felt achingly familiar, as though a forgotten memory had brushed his soul. He recalled the shape of his own childhood face, the intensity of his mother's eyes, and for a fraction of a second, he could almost see a mirror image in the beggar's tear-streaked cheeks. He spent the next few days in a haze. Business deals that would have normally consumed his attention barely registered. He replayed the stranger's plea, the way the man had clung to him, how his voice had cracked when he spoke the words. He sent his top private investigator to scour every record in the city and beyond. DNA samples were requested from the beggar at the precinct and submitted for analysis. In the meantime, the millionaire wrestled with his skepticism and hope. What if this man really was his son? He knew he had given up a child decades ago in a moment of desperation, long before he built his empire. 15 years earlier, before his breakthrough in the tech world, he and his then-girlfriend had faced the unthinkable. They were young, barely out of college, and struggled to pay rent. When she fell pregnant, they dared to dream of a life beyond their cramped apartment. But fate intervened. A sudden illness drained their savings, and medical bills piled up. They made the heartbreaking decision to give their baby up for adoption, hoping to provide him with a chance at a better life. They never saw him again. He closed his eyes and remembered holding that tiny infant so fragile and precious. He'd promised himself he'd build a life worthy of being her father. He had in every sense, except one. He never found his child. For decades he had carried that loss like a scar beneath his skin. And now here was this man, unkempt and broken, yet calling him son. As days turned into a week, the millionaire could not eat, could not sleep. He paced his penthouse apartment, high above the city lights, surrounded by luxury that now felt hollow. His assistant kept him informed. The DNA lab had expedited the results. They would be ready at any moment. He paced the floor beside a mahogany coffee table, hands clasped behind his back, listening to his own ragged breathing. Then the call came. He was walking through the marble lobby of his building when his phone buzzed. He tapped the screen with trembling fingers. The private investigator spoke first, voice careful. The results are conclusive. There is an immediate genetic match. The man is your biological son. Time seemed to warp. He could feel the floor beneath him grow unsteady. His vision blurred, and for a moment he couldn't tell whether tears in his eyes were from shock or relief. He steadied himself against the sleek reception desk, nodding slowly. "Thank you," he managed. He hung up, every nerve alive with emotion. He returned to his office. His secretary looked up, concern in her eyes. Without a word, he walked past her and into his private conference room. He sank into a leather chair and stared at the blank wall for a long minute. Then, with that same resolve that had driven him to the top of the financial world, he made a decision. He called the precinct and arranged to see his son. He arrived at the station just as dusk was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The hallways smelled of antiseptic and old paper. He found the small interview room where the begging man had sat. A chair was placed opposite a metal table. He took his seat, his heart pounding so loud he thought the officers outside would hear it. Moments later, the door opened and the man stepped in. He wore the same tattered coat, but somehow now he looked different. His shoulders hunched, eyes wary. The recognition passed between them instantly. The billionaire reached across the table, placed his hand over the beggar's. "I'm your father," he said softly. His voice was thick. The man's jaw trembled. He stared at the hand covering his own. Neither spoke for a long moment. Then his lip quivered and tears filled his eyes. He jerked his hand away, burying his face in his coat. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I've waited so long." The millionaire closed his eyes and exhaled. He slid out of his chair, walked around the table, and embraced him. There were no cameras, no audience, just the two of them in that sterile room, reunited after years of separation. Over the weeks that followed, the millionaire set about the practical steps of reconnecting. He got his son a small apartment, cleaned him up, clothed him in new shirts and trousers. He arranged for him to see doctors, counselors, and even a barber. But more importantly, he offered what he had denied himself for 15 years: a relationship. At first, the son resisted. He was convinced it was another cruel joke. He'd spent years developing a hardened shell against disappointment and betrayal. He distrusted kindness. But the millionaire was patient. He called him every day, invited him to lunch at a modest cafe rather than a grand restaurant. He listened to his stories of streets and shelters, of insults hurled at him, of nights spent under bridges. He did not flinch or judge. Slowly, walls cracked. The son spoke of his mother, how she had tucked him into bed when he was small, how her face haunted his dreams. The millionaire remembered her too, her gentle laugh and the way she brushed his hair from his forehead. She had died just 2 years after giving birth, succumbing to the same illness that had pushed them to give up the baby. He had no chance to say goodbye to his child or to her. Together, they visited her grave. It was a small headstone in a quiet cemetery just outside the city limits. Sunlight filtered through ancient oaks. The son knelt and placed wildflowers he had picked on the gravel. He whispered words that only a son could say to the mother who never got to raise him. Tears fell freely, mingling with the dirt. Afterward, they walked through the rows of stones until they found the children's section, where tiny markers clustered in neat lines. The son's small hand slipped into his father's. "I feel like I finally belong," he said. The billionaire squeezed his hand, voice thick. "You always did." Months passed. The son enrolled in a vocational program, first to learn basic computer skills, then graphic design, fields his father knew well. He absorbed knowledge with fierce determination, as though making up for lost time. The millionaire watched with pride and pain woven into equal strands. He saw echoes of his own youth in his son's hunger to succeed. At the unveiling of his son's first gallery exhibit, a series of digital paintings inspired by urban decay and human resilience, the millionaire stood in the back of the room, tears glistening in his eyes. The walls were lined with polished screens displaying the images. People moved between them, murmuring admiration. The son spotted his father and crossed the room, eyes bright with triumph and something deeper, something like love. They embraced in front of the crowd, and for an instant, the world faded away. The millionaire realized that the fortune he'd built, the skyscrapers and corporations, were secondary. What mattered most was this moment, the reunion of a family torn apart by circumstance and tragedy, now made whole. In the years that followed, father and son worked together on charitable endeavors, establishing foundations to help children at risk, to offer support for those facing the same fate his son had endured. They visited shelters, spoke at schools, and gave scholarships. They transformed pain into purpose. The millionaire often reflected on that morning when a broken beggar had hugged him on the street and called him son. At first it had felt like an intrusion, an unwelcome disruption to his orderly life. But it turned out to be the greatest gift he had ever received. And as he watched his son standing beside him at the podium of a packed auditorium, introducing their latest initiative, a center for foster children designed to give them safe homes and loving mentors, he knew that the shock of that DNA result had led them both to a new beginning. A beginning grounded not in wealth or power, but in the simple truth of family and the unbreakable bond between a father and his son.